The court has been silent for 9 days. Lady Yun knows this because she has counted every one of them. Every morning the servants entered without speaking. Every evening the candles were extinguished without ceremony. She is sitting in the eastern chamber of Changdejiang Palace, in a room she has not been permitted to leave since the king died. She is 23 years old. 8 days ago, she was the second consort of King Siongjong of Joseon, one of the most powerful monarchs in the dynasty's 200-year history. She had influence, she had position. She had the ear of a king who consulted her on matters that other women in the palace were never told existed. She had a future. This morning a court official came to her chamber and read aloud from a document she was not permitted to touch. He read for approximately 4 minutes. When he finished, he bowed, rolled the document closed, and left without meeting her eyes. Lady Yun sat with what she had just heard for a long time. She understood every word. That was the problem. What that document contained, what was being prepared for her, and for 7 other women in this palace right now. In this week, in the immediate aftermath of a king's death, is the subject of tonight's video. And I need to tell you something before we go any further. What happened to royal widows in the Joseon dynasty is not a story that appears in the histories you were taught about Korea. It does not appear in the official annals of the Joseon dynasty, the most comprehensive historical record any pre-modern government ever kept, because the men who wrote those annals had very specific reasons to record some things, and to make other things disappear. It does not appear in the Western accounts of Korean history, because Western scholars who studied Korea in the 19th and 20th centuries drew primarily from sources that the Korean court had already decided to preserve. What it appears in are the documents that survived by accident. Petition records, exile orders, the private correspondence of Neo-Confucian scholars who disagreed with what they were watching, and wrote their disagreement down knowing no one in power would listen. The testimony of women who eventually escaped, or were allowed to escape, and who described what they had experienced, to people who preserved those descriptions in forms that were never meant to be official history. I have read those documents. What they describe about the treatment of royal widows in Joseon Korea, across 500 years of dynastic rule, is systematic, documented, and almost entirely unknown outside a small circle of Korean academic specialists. Subscribe right now if you want history from the primary sources rather than the sanitized version. Because Lady Yun is still sitting in that eastern chamber, and what is coming for her is something that no one told her about when she entered this palace. But first, I need to explain something that makes everything else in this video make sense. I need to explain what Joseon Korea actually was. Part 2. The state that Neo-Confucianism built. You have heard of Confucianism. You learned about it the way most people learn about it, as an ancient Chinese philosophy emphasizing family loyalty, social harmony, and respect for hierarchy. Those things are true. They are also the surface of something far more specific and far more consequential for the women of Joseon Korea. The Joseon dynasty was founded in 1392 by General Yi Seonggi, who overthrew the previous Goryeo kingdom and established a new state on a single ideological foundation. That foundation was Neo-Confucianism, a revived, systematized, and considerably more rigid version of classical Confucian thought that had been developed in China during the Song dynasty, and that the Joseon founders adopted with an enthusiasm that went beyond anything their Chinese counterparts had attempted. The Chinese applied Neo-Confucian principles selectively, pragmatically, with the flexibility that large empires develop when they cannot enforce everything everywhere. The Joseon applied them as a total social program. What this meant, in practice, is that Neo-Confucian doctrine did not merely influence Joseon society. It governed it completely, specifically, with legal enforcement mechanisms and bureaucratic structures dedicated to its implementation. And Neo-Confucian doctrine had very specific things to say about women, specifically about widows. The principle was called yael, a concept that Korean scholars translate as fidelity or chastity, but that neither of those English words captures with sufficient precision. Yael was not merely the expectation that a widow would grieve, it was the doctrine that a woman's loyalty to her husband did not end with his death, that it was, in fact, more purely expressed after his death than during his lifetime, because after his death there was no practical benefit to fidelity. and therefore fidelity after death was the only form that proved the loyalty was real. The logical extension of this doctrine, and the Joseon Neo-Confucians were not people who stopped short of logical extensions, was that a widow who continued to live a normal life after her husband's death was by definition failing to demonstrate Yale, a widow who remarried was failing catastrophically, and a widow who expressed any desire for a life that did not center entirely on the memory of her dead husband was committing something that the Joseon legal code treated as a form of moral crime. For ordinary women, the consequences of this doctrine were severe. For royal widows, they were something else entirely. Something that the official histories decided not to record clearly. Something that took me months of reading oblique sources to reconstruct. Let me tell you what it was. Part 3. The hierarchy of confinement. The Joseon court was not a single place. I need you to understand this before we go further, because most Western understandings of Asian royal courts imagine them as unified spaces, a palace where the king and his family lived. Changdeokgung, the palace where Lady Yun was confined, was a complex of dozens of separate buildings, gardens, administrative halls, and residential quarters spread across an area larger than many medieval European cities. Within that complex, the women of the royal household lived in a separate section called the Namyeongjin, the inner court. The inner court had its own hierarchy. At its top was the queen consort, the official wife of the king, whose status was defined by the rituals and legal codes of the dynasty with a precision that governed everything from the color of her robes to the number of attendants she was permitted. Below the queen were the royal consorts, women of noble families who had been selected through a formal examination process called the ganchik, assessed for their physical presentation, their family lineage, their knowledge of Confucian texts, and their capacity to produce male heirs. Lady Yun was the second consort of King Seongjong. She had been selected at 14. She had entered the palace at 15. She had spent 8 years navigating a social environment of extraordinary complexity, a world of hierarchies within hierarchies, of alliances formed and broken over the distribution of the king's attention, of ceremonies and protocols that governed every waking hour and many sleeping ones. She understood this world completely. What she did not understand, until the morning the court official read that document to her, was that the world she understood was about to be replaced by a different world entirely. A world with different rules. A world she had not been told existed. The transition from royal consort to royal widow in the Joseon dynasty was not merely a change in personal status. It was a categorical reclassification that carried specific legal consequences, specific physical consequences, and specific social consequences, consequences that had been systematically withheld from the women who would experience them. Let me explain why they were withheld, and then let me explain what they were. Part 4. What the Annals chose not to say. The Joseon Wangzhou Silak, the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty, is one of the most remarkable documents in human history. It is not an exaggeration to say that, compiled continuously from 1413 to 1865, covering more than 400 years of dynastic rule, written by historians whose explicit mandate was to record everything the king said and did. The Annals constitute a historical record of a scope and detail that no other pre-modern government came close to achieving. The historians who compiled the Annals were called Saganwan, court historians. They had a specific, legally protected independence from the king's authority. A king was not permitted to read the annals of his own reign. The historical record of his rule was compiled in real time, but sealed until after his death, specifically to prevent him from influencing what was recorded. This independence produced a document of extraordinary candor about political events, policy disputes, and the personal behavior of the men who ran the Joseon state. Not because the historians were unaware of what was happening. 2 women in the palace? Because the Neo-Confucian framework that governed what counted as historically significant defined women's experiences as private matters rather than public events. A king's decision to execute a political rival was a public event. It was recorded. What happened to the king's widows after his death was a private matter. It was managed. The distinction between recorded and managed is the gap that tonight's video is going to fill. Because what was managed? What happened to royal widows in Joseon, Korea in the days, months, and years after a king's death? is documented in the sources that were never meant to constitute a historical record. In the petition documents filed by court officials who objected to specific implementations of the policy and whose objections were preserved because legal proceedings required it. In the private letters of Neo-Confucian scholars writing to each other about what they were observing, letters that survived in family archives centuries after everyone involved was dead. In the records of Buddhist temples located outside the capital, which received certain categories of royal women and kept their own documentation of who arrived, in what condition, and what happened to them. In the physical evidence, archaeological, architectural, of spaces that were built for specific purposes, and that tell their story through their design when the written record will not tell it directly. These sources exist. They have been in archives, in temple records, in family collections, for centuries. Have not been assembled into the account I am about to give you. Until tonight, Part 5. The 9 days. Let me go back to those 9 days of silence. The period immediately following a Joseon king's death was governed by mourning protocols of extraordinary specificity. The official mourning period was 27 months, a number derived from Neo-Confucian calculations about the appropriate duration of grief for a parent, applied to the death of a king. During those 27 months, the entire court was subject to restrictions that touched every aspect of daily life. Music was prohibited, silk clothing above certain grades was prohibited, meat was prohibited, alcohol was prohibited. The restrictions on the king's widows were different in kind, not just in degree. For the queen consort and the royal consorts, the 27 months of official mourning were the period during which their new status was defined and consolidated. Not through ceremony, not through announcement, through a process of progressive restriction that the sources described consistently enough that it clearly followed a recognized pattern. The first restriction was movement. Within 24 hours of the king's death, the residential quarters of the royal women were placed under a form of supervision that had no official name in the court documents, but that the petition records describe with enough specificity to understand what it involved. Guards were posted, not to protect the women inside, to regulate who could enter and who could leave, and what information moved in either direction. The second restriction was communication. The royal widows' access to the outside world, to their families, to the broader court, to information about what was happening in the political transition following the king's death, was filtered through officials, whose role was not to facilitate communication but to manage it. What this meant in practice was that the women in the inner court knew what the new administration wanted them to know, and nothing else. The third restriction was the one that Lady Yun had just learned about from the document the court official read to her. It was not a restriction on movement or communication. It was a restriction on existence itself. Let me explain what I mean by that. Part 6. What Yeo required in practice. The doctrine of Yeo, the fidelity that a widow owed to her dead husband, had a theoretical version and a practical version. The theoretical version was taught to young women of noble families as part of their education in Confucian ethics. It was presented as a moral ideal, the highest expression of female virtue, the demonstration that a woman's loyalty transcended even death. The exemplars of Yael were presented as heroic figures, women who had chosen death over remarriage, women who had mutilated themselves to become unmarriageable rather than violate their fidelity to dead husbands, women who had starved themselves, or refused medical treatment, or walked into rivers. These women were commemorated. Their names were recorded in official histories. Their villages were given tax exemptions. Their families received official recognition. The state built markers at the sites of their deaths. The Joseon government actively promoted these stories. There were government offices whose specific function was to identify and commemorate examples of youth, and here is what that promotion meant in practice, which is something the theoretical version of the doctrine never stated directly. A woman who chose death to demonstrate fidelity to her dead husband was a hero. A woman who chose life and remained a widow was acceptable, barely, provisionally, under conditions. A woman who chose life and sought any form of normal human existence after her husband's death was a moral failure, and a royal widow, a woman whose husband had been the Son of Heaven, whose fidelity was therefore not merely a personal virtue but a matter of cosmic and political order. A royal widow who failed to demonstrate Yale adequately was not merely a moral failure, she was a threat to the legitimacy of the dynasty, a threat to the Neo-Confucian order that the dynasty was built to embody, a threat to the new king, whose authority rested in part on the proper management of the previous king's legacy. The management of royal widows was not, in this framework, cruelty, it was state. That is the distinction that makes this history so difficult to confront, and it is the distinction that explains why what happened to Lady Yun was not exceptional, it was policy. Part 7. The categories. The Joseon dynasty managed its royal widows through a system of categorical assignment. I want to be precise about this, because precision is what separates documented history from speculation. The system had 3 primary categories, each with specific conditions of life, specific legal status, and specific physical environments. The first category was palace confinement. A royal widow assigned to palace confinement remained within the inner court of the palace, but was restricted to a specific section of that court, typically the westernmost chambers, positioned away from the main ceremonial spaces, and away from the residential areas of the current king's household. She retained her official title. She retained a staff of attendants. She did not retain freedom of movement, freedom of communication, or any role in the court functions that had previously constituted her daily life. She lived in the palace as its memory, present but not participating, titled but not functional. The sources that document this category describe the conditions, with a detail that is specific about what these women's daily lives actually looked like. They described the progressive reduction of the widow's staff as years passed, attendants reassigned, replaced, eventually not replaced at all. They described the physical deterioration of the confined quarters, repairs not made, furnishings not renewed, the slow material evidence of diminishing relevance. They describe the widows themselves in terms that are careful but consistent. Women who have been politically sophisticated and socially active becoming, over years of confinement, something quieter and harder to see. The second category was temple exile. This is the category that the Buddhist temple records document most clearly, because temples were meticulous administrators and kept records of the people in their care. A royal widow assigned to temple exile was removed from the palace entirely and sent to a Buddhist establishment, typically one of the major temples in the mountains outside Seoul, far enough from the capital that her presence would not constitute a political complication. The assignment was described in official documents as an act of piety, the widow choosing a religious life to honor her husband's memory. The petition records tell a different story. They describe women who were given days to prepare for departure, who were escorted by officials, not accompanied by family, who arrived at temples that had been notified they were coming but had not been consulted about whether they wished to receive them. The temples cared for these women. The temple records show that clearly, but the temple records also show the conditions under which they arrived, and the conditions are not consistent with women who had made a free choice to pursue religious life. The third category is the one that the official sources are most careful to avoid describing directly, and it is the category that Lady Yun was about to encounter. Subscribe right now before I tell you what it was, because what the court official read to her from that document, what had been decided for her in the 9 days of silence since the king died, was not palace confinement, and it was not temple exile. It was something that the Joseon court had used selectively, strategically, and with the specific intention that it would never become a matter of public record. Part 8. The document. Let me tell you what the document said. It said that Lady Yun, second consort of the late King Xianzhang, had been found to have conducted herself in a manner inconsistent with the standards of the royal household. It said that her conduct had been examined by the relevant court officials. It said that the examination had produced findings that required a response. It did not specify what the conduct was. It did not describe the examination. It did not name the officials who had conducted it, or explain the process by which the findings had been reached. What it specified was the response, and the response was expressed in language so formulaic, so embedded in the bureaucratic conventions of the Joseon court, that its meaning would have been invisible to anyone who did not already know what the formula meant. Lady Yun knew what it meant. She had been in this palace for 8 years. She had watched what happened to other women when certain formulas were applied. She sat with what she had heard for a long time because she was doing the calculation, the specific, careful calculation that the sources describe other women in her situation doing. The calculation about what options existed and what each option cost and whether any option was better than the one that had just been decided for her without her input. The calculation did not take long, not because the options were clear, because there were no options. What had been decided was final. What had been decided was also, and this is the element that the official sources most carefully suppress, not about Lady Yun's conduct at all. It was about politics. Let me explain the political context, because without it, what happened to Lady Yun looks like the story of one woman. With it, it becomes the story of a system. Part 9. The politics of widowhood. King Xianzhang died in 1494 after a reign of 25 years. He left behind him a court divided by the factional conflicts that characterized Joseon politics throughout the dynasty's history. The factions were not primarily about policy, or not only about policy, they were about bloodlines, about which aristocratic families had positioned themselves closest to the center of royal power, about who would have influence over the new king, and therefore over the resources and appointments. That royal influence controlled. The new king was young Sungun, Xianzhang's son by his first queen, who had been executed when young Sungun was very young, for reasons that the official records describe with the kind of careful vagueness that indicates the real reasons were too complicated to state. Young Sungun was 19 years old when his father died. He was, by the accounts of the court historians who recorded his reign, accounts written after his eventual removal from power, which colors them, but that are consistent enough with other sources to be useful. A young man who had grown up in the specific emotional environment of a royal household that had executed his mother, surrounded by people who had participated in that execution or benefited from it. The court officials who managed the transition from Xianzhang's reign to Yan Sungun's reign were navigating a political landscape of extraordinary complexity. The royal widows, the late king's consorts, were part of that landscape, not because of anything they had done, because of what they represented. A royal widow was a living connection to the previous reign. She carried institutional memory, knowledge of the previous king's preferences, relationships, decisions, the informal architecture of how power had actually operated during his reign. She had relationships with court officials, aristocratic families, and palace servants that predated the current king's rule. She potentially had information about the factional conflicts of the previous reign, about the decisions that had been made, about who had done what to whom that could be politically dangerous in the wrong hands. The management of royal widows was, therefore, not only a matter of Neo-Confucian doctrine about Yale, it was a matter of political security, and the specific form that management took depended entirely on who the widow was connected to, what she knew, and which faction in the new court perceived her as a threat or as a resource. Lady Yun's connections were to a faction that was losing. Her knowledge included information about events in Xianzhang's court that certain officials in Yonsungun's court needed to remain buried. The document was not about her conduct, it was about what she knew. Part 10. The process that followed the reading of the document was specific. It was specific because it had been used before, and because institutions that use something multiple times develop procedures, and procedures become habitual, and habits become invisible, precisely because they are so thoroughly normalized. The first stage was isolation. Lady Yun's attendants were reduced within 48 hours of the document being read. Not all removed, that would have been too visible, too obviously punitive, inconsistent with the official framing that what was happening to her was a matter of moral correction rather than political elimination. Reduced, gradually, with a kind of administrative efficiency that looks, from the outside, like budget management rather than targeted removal of the people who constituted her social world. Within 2 weeks, the attendants who remained were not women she had chosen and trusted. They were women who had been assigned to her. The distinction matters enormously. It meant that everything she said and did was observed by people whose loyalty was not to her. It meant she had no privacy in any meaningful sense. It meant she was alone in the specific and devastating way that is possible only when you are surrounded by people, and still completely isolated. The second stage was examination. The document had referenced findings from an examination without specifying what the examination was or when it had occurred. An additional examination was now conducted. The sources that describe these examinations are careful about the language they use. They describe the process as an inquiry, a formal proceeding, a review of evidence and testimony. What they do not describe is who conducted the inquiry, whether Lady Yun had any representation in the proceeding, or what standards governed the evidence presented. The petition records filed by court officials who objected to specific examinations, and there were such officials, and their petitions are in the archives, describe the process in terms that make its nature somewhat clearer. They describe examinations that proceeded from a conclusion already reached, gathering evidence to support a decision that had been made before the examination began. They describe the treatment of the women being examined in language that is oblique but consistent across multiple independent sources. They describe examinations that lasted days. One petition, filed by a mid-level official named Kim Jong-ik, whose name appears in the annals in the context of his eventual punishment for his objections, describes what he witnessed in terms that cost him his career, and eventually more than his career. He wrote that what he had seen was not an examination. He wrote that what he had seen was a performance of justification for something that had already been decided. He wrote that the women involved had no mechanism to challenge what was being done to them, and that the absence of any such mechanism was not an oversight, it was the point. His petition was rejected. He was removed from his position. He continued writing. Part 11. What the temple records show. Let me bring in the physical evidence, because the documentary record benefits enormously from the corroboration of a different kind of source. The Buddhist temples that received royal widows during the Joseon dynasty were, as I mentioned earlier, meticulous record keepers. This was partly because Buddhist institutions in the Joseon period operated under constant scrutiny from a government that was ideologically committed to Confucianism and that viewed Buddhism with a suspicion ranging from mild official disapproval to active persecution depending on the decade and the specific king. A temple that could prove it was operating correctly, that it was receiving the people it was supposed to receive and managing them according to the conditions specified in official documents, was a temple that was less likely to become the target of government action. So the temples kept records, and those records, preserved in temple archives that academic researchers have been studying in systematic detail only in the past several decades, contain information that the official court documents do not. They contain the names of women who arrived. They contain the dates of arrival, the stated reason for the assignment, and the conditions attached. They contain in the records of daily distributions, food, medicine, firewood, candles, the material evidence of how many people were being housed, under what conditions, and how those conditions changed over time. And they contain, in the notes written by temple administrators that were never intended to become historical sources, observations about the women and their care that are the most direct testimony we have from people who actually saw what these women looked like when they arrived. The notes are brief. They are the annotations of busy administrators, not the reflections of historians. But they are consistent across different temples, different decades, different administrators. They describe women who arrived unable to stand without assistance. They describe women who did not speak for the first weeks of their residence. They describe women who arrived in the middle of winter, inadequately dressed for travel, as if the departure had been too sudden to allow for preparation. They describe women who asked, repeatedly, about the status of their children, children who in many cases had remained in the palace, and who received no answers because the temple administrators had no information to give them. They describe, in one case preserved in the archives of Banjunsa Temple, outside Seoul, a woman who arrived and ate nothing for 11 days, and who the temple administrator visited personally on the 11th day to tell her that eating was not giving up, that staying alive was not a betrayal of anyone. The administrator recorded that she ate. He did not record her name. He did not record what happened to her after that. The record simply continues with the next entry. Part 12. The children. I need to stop here, because this is the part of the story that the sources document and that the human brain resists accepting, and I am going to ask you to stay with me through it. The children of royal widows were not classified together with their mothers. This is the element of the Joseon widow management system that the official sources are most thoroughly silent about, and that the oblique sources, the petition records, the private letters, the temple notes, document it with enough consistency to establish it as systematic rather than exceptional. The children of a late king belonged to the dynasty, not to their mothers. In legal terms, in practical terms, in the terms that governed the actual management of their lives after their father's death, the children of a royal consort were the property of the institution rather than the children of a specific woman. What this meant depended on the sex of the child, the age of the child, and the political circumstances of the transition. Male children of sufficient age were integrated into the dynastic succession structure, either as candidates for later royal positions or as potential figures around whom future factional conflict might organize. The management of these children was accordingly careful, their movements monitored, their associations controlled, their educations shaped by officials who understood that a royal son was a political asset and a political liability simultaneously. Female children had a different trajectory. The records document a pattern in which the daughters of royal consorts who had been assigned to confinement or exile were themselves assigned, not immediately, not always quickly, but eventually. Two positions within the palace hierarchy that kept them close enough to be managed and distant enough from power to pose no threat. What the records do not document clearly, what the oblique sources gesture at but do not state, is the experience of these children in the period of transition, the period between their mother's classification and their own placement. The petition of Kim Jung-jik, which I referenced earlier, contains a passage that historians have cited primarily for its political significance, but that contains, embedded in its legal language, a description of this transitional period that is worth reading carefully. He writes about the confusion of the household. He writes about the absence of instruction to the children of the classified women. He writes about children who were old enough to understand that something had happened to their mothers, but not old enough to understand what, or why, or what would happen to them as a result. He does not describe what he saw in terms of emotion. He describes it in the terms of administrative failure. The system had not made adequate provision for this transition. The children were not being managed according to any discernible protocol. The situation was creating disorder that reflected poorly on the court's competence. He is writing a petition, not a diary. But behind the administrative language, what he is describing is visible. He is describing children who had lost their mothers without being told that they had lost their mothers. He filed the petition. It was rejected. Part 13. Lady Yun's decision. For weeks after the court official read the document to her, Lady Yun made a decision. The sources that preserve fragments of what happened to her in this period do not describe the decision in her own words. We do not have her words. What we have is the description of her behavior in the weeks that followed, recorded in the notes of an official whose function was to observe and report on the classified royal widows, and whose reports filed as administrative documents, not as historical narratives survived in the State Council records that were not among the materials systematically reviewed by later official historians. These reports describe a woman who stopped eating for 3 days, not fully. She accepted water. She accepted small amounts of plain rice. But she stopped participating in the ceremonial elements of the daily schedule that remained imposed on her, the morning prayers, the afternoon rituals, the evening observances that constituted the formal structure of a royal widow's managed existence. She sat. She did not speak except when spoken to. She did not comply with the instructions of the attendants who had been assigned to manage her, not dramatically, not in ways that generated confrontation. She simply did not do what she was asked. The administrative observer's report describes her behavior as requiring additional management and notes that additional management was requested from the senior court official overseeing the classified widows. The report does not say what Lady Yun was thinking, but the sources that preserve other women's testimonies from similar periods of non-compliance describe a state of mind that is specific enough to function as context. They describe women who had made a calculation, not about escape. Escape was not possible. Not about rescue. Rescue was not coming. About cost. About what complying with the system cost in terms of what remained of the self after compliance. about whether compliance was a form of survival or a form of disappearance that merely extended the timeline. The calculation did not always produce the same answer. Some women complied. Some women found ways to exist within the constraints that preserved enough of themselves to constitute survival. Some did not. Lady Yun's calculation produced an answer that the Administrative Observer's Report describes as requiring escalation. Let me tell you what escalation meant. Part 14. The escalation. The official who received the request for additional management of Lady Yun was a man named Gui. His name appears in the annals of the Joseon dynasty in a different context. He was a mid-ranking official in the Board of Punishments, the court body that administered the dynasty's criminal justice system. He appears in the administrative records I have been describing in his capacity as an overseer of the classified royal widows, a role that was not his primary function but that had been assigned to him because the Board of Punishments had the relevant expertise. The relevant expertise, that phrase carries enormous weight. The Board of Punishments administered the Joseon justice system, which included a codified set of physical punishments calibrated to the severity of different offenses. The application of those punishments to criminal defendants was the board's primary function. The application of management techniques derived from those punishments to the classified royal widows was, and this is what the sources document, with enough oblique consistency to be reliable, a secondary function that the board administered through specific officials who understood the calibration required. The calibration, the petition records filed by objecting officials are the sources that describe the calibration most directly. They describe it in the language of objection. This is wrong. This violates the principles of governance, but the nature of the wrong they are describing is specific enough to reconstruct. They describe the application of physical management techniques to women who were not criminal defendants, women who had not been charged with crimes, women who had not been tried or convicted, women who had been classified as royal widows, requiring management, and who were receiving management in the form that the Board of Punishments knew how to deliver. Gui arrived at the Eastern Chamber where Lady Yun was confined on the 32nd day after the king's death. He arrived with 2 assistants and a document authorizing the additional management that had been requested. What happened in that chamber is not described in the official records. It is described in the terms of administrative reportage rather than direct testimony. In the observer's notes that survived in the State Council records, and it is described, in considerably more direct terms, in a private letter written by a scholar named Yi Meng-hak to a colleague in the South. Yi Meng-hak was not present. He was describing what he had been told by someone who was. His letter is one of the most important sources in this investigation because it is one of the few places where a person who had access to direct testimony chose to record that testimony without the filtering of official language. He wrote that what had been done to Lady Yun was a punishment, not a management technique, not a calibration. A punishment, administered to a woman who had committed no crime, for the purpose of making an example. Not an example to her, she already understood what she was facing. An example to the other women in the palace who were watching, who were calculating their own compliance, who needed to understand what non-compliance produced. He wrote this in a private letter to a colleague. He sent it knowing it might be intercepted. He sent it anyway. Part 15. What the women knew here is something that the standard histories of Joseon court life almost never tell you. The women in the inner court were not isolated from each other's experiences. The physical architecture of the inner court separated the classified widows from the active royal household, and the management system was designed to restrict communication. But institutions that manage large numbers of people in proximity cannot prevent information from moving entirely. It moves through servants, through the women who prepare food, through the attendants who carry messages and whose paths cross in corridors, and who speak briefly in the few seconds when they are not directly observed. It moves in the specific coded language that people in controlled environments develop, the references that mean nothing to an outsider and everything to someone who has lived in the same environment long enough to learn the code. The women in the active royal household knew what was happening to the classified widows. Not in detail, not with the precision of the administrative reports or Yi Meng-hak's letter, but enough. They knew the categories. They knew that classification was possible. They knew that classification was not only possible but had happened recently, was happening now. 2 women they had known, and they knew, from the evidence of behavior and appearance on the few occasions when the classified women were visible, something about what classification produced. The scholar Park Yesum, writing in the mid-16th century about the period of Yonsungun's rule, describes the effect of this knowledge on the women of the inner court in terms that are remarkable. For a male scholar of his period, writing about women's interior experience, he describes what he calls the atmosphere of the palace, the quality of daily life for the women who were not classified but who understood that classification was possible. He describes it as a weight, a specific, constant weight that had no source you could point to, generated no action you could take, but was present in every interaction and every decision. He describes women who became expert at calculation, at reading the political situation, at identifying which behaviors were safe and which might generate scrutiny, at navigating the space between visible compliance and the maintenance of whatever interior life they could protect. He describes this expertise with admiration, which is unusual, and his admiration is revealing, because what he is admiring is the kind of intelligence that operates entirely in constraint, that has no outlet, except the management of its own survival. He is describing women who were, in the formal framework of Neo-Confucian Joseon, supposed to have no interior life worth describing, and who had, in the actual evidence of their behavior under pressure, interior lives of extraordinary complexity and resilience. That is the part of this history that I do not want you to leave without. Part 16. The Long Aftermath. Lady survived the 32nd day. The observer's notes record that she was returned to her chamber, and that the additional management had been administered. The notes use the administrative language of completion. The action had been taken. The situation had been resolved. The management had been delivered. They do not describe her condition. The next entry in the observer's notes is dated 11 days later. It describes her as compliant. It describes the restoration of the morning observances, the afternoon rituals, the evening prayers. It notes that she had eaten regularly for 9 days. That is the language the notes use: regularly, not well, not adequately, regularly. The distinction in administrative language is important. Regularly means the minimum required to maintain function. It means the calculus of survival had been concluded and the answer was, continue. I want you to understand what it means to survive that conclusion. Not in abstract terms, in the specific terms that the sources read carefully, allow us to reconstruct. It means waking up in a chamber you cannot leave and performing the rituals required of you. It means speaking when spoken to and not speaking otherwise. It means existing in a system that has demonstrated its capacity and its willingness to produce what it produced on the 32nd day, and choosing every morning to cooperate with that system rather than give it another occasion to demonstrate. It means maintaining, somewhere behind the compliance, something that is still you, some residual understanding of who you were before the 9 days of silence, before the document, before the 32nd day, whether that maintenance is possible, whether what survives it is the same thing that went into it. These are the questions that the sources raise and cannot answer, because the sources were not designed to answer them. Lady Yun disappears from the administrative records in 1497, 3 years after the king's death. She reappears in the temple records of Gyeomsansa in the Jeolla province, a temple in the mountains, far from Seoul, in an entry dated 1498. The entry records her arrival. It records the stated reason for her presence: voluntary religious retreat. It records the conditions attached. She was not to leave the temple grounds without authorization from the court. It records, in a marginal note by the temple administrator, that she arrived in autumn and that the autumn had been cold. She remained at Gyeomsansa for 11 years. The temple records show she was alive in 1509. After that, the records stopped. Not because she left, because the records stopped. The temple was damaged in a fire in 1511. The administrative records from the period after 1509 did not survive. We do not know when she died. We do not know the circumstances. We do not know whether she died in the mountain temple that had become her world, or whether the world changed around her in ways that gave her somewhere else to go. We do not know whether she ever learned what had happened to her children. We do not know whether the interior life she had maintained through compliance and calculation, and the small survivals available to a woman in her position had preserved enough of her that the years in the mountain temple felt like anything other than the remainder of a sentence. We do not know. What we know is that she was there, that she survived what was done to her, that she endured 11 years in a mountain temple far from everything she had known, that in 1509, an administrator at Gyeomsansa noted her presence in a record of daily disputation, that the notation is routine, unremarkable, a single line among many, that she existed, that her existence was recorded, however briefly, however routinely, that we can read her name. Part 17. Why this was suppressed. Let me be precise about why this history remained unknown, not lost, not merely forgotten, suppressed. The Joseon government had the most comprehensive record-keeping apparatus in the pre-modern world. It did not fail to record what happened to royal widows. It made deliberate choices about what the record would contain. Those choices were made by the same men who administered the system, who had designed the classifications, who had authorized the examinations, who had sent officials like Eomgui to chambers in the palace. They wrote the official history of their own administration. They wrote it with the specific understanding that the official history was what would survive, what would be read, what would constitute the authoritative account of the period. The petition records survived because legal proceedings required the preservation of filings even when they were rejected. The private letters survived because private archives are harder to manage than official ones. The temple records survived because temple administrators cared about their own records, and the government did not think to include them in the materials it managed. The marginal notes survived because no one thought to review the margins. The history was not preserved deliberately, it was preserved accidentally, in the gaps of a system that was thorough but not perfect, in the spaces between the official record and everything else. And it remained unknown, not because scholars lacked access to the sources, but because the questions that would have unlocked those sources were not being asked. The Korean academic historians who have worked most directly with these materials, scholars like Kim Youngmin at Seoul National University, and Lee Sunja, whose work on Hosa women's legal status represents decades of archival research, have been asking those questions systematically for the past 30 years. What they have found is consistent with what the oblique sources from 5 centuries ago already contained. The management of royal widows in Joseon Korea was systematic. It was authorized. It was implemented by specific officials following specific procedures. It was known to the court officials who observed it and who sometimes objected to it. It was managed out of the official historical record by the people who controlled what the official historical record contained. And it continued, in various forms, across the entire 500-year span of the dynasty, not consistently, not identically. The specific conditions changed with each king's death, each factional configuration, each shift in the political landscape. But the structure remained, the categories remained. The system for managing women whose continued existence posed a political or institutional inconvenience remained. Because the doctrine that justified it remained. Because the doctrine was the foundation of everything. Part 18. What remains? I want to close with something that I think matters. Not about the policy, not about the doctrine, about the women. The women whose experiences I have been describing tonight are not primarily victims of an ideological system. They were people. Specific people with specific histories, specific knowledge, specific relationships, specific interior lives that the system they were trapped in tried to manage out of existence. The sources that preserve fragments of their experience are oblique, incomplete, filtered through perspectives that were not designed to preserve what matters most about what they went through. But they preserve enough. They preserved Lady Yoon sitting with the document for a long time before she said anything. They preserved Sigurd in the temple records noting that a woman had stopped eating and that someone had told her that staying alive was not a betrayal. They preserved Kim Jung-jik writing his petition, knowing it would be rejected, and writing it anyway. They preserved Yi Mung-hek sending his letter, knowing it might be intercepted and sending it anyway. They preserved the mountain temple administrator writing, in the margin of a supply list, that the autumn had been cold. These are not heroic acts in the way that the Neo-Confucian exemplars of Yale were heroic. They are smaller than that. They are the ordinary acts of people who saw something that deserved to be recorded and recorded it, who told someone what they had witnessed, who stayed alive in the face of reasons not to, who ate. The history that was suppressed is recoverable because of these ordinary acts by ordinary/people who lived inside the system and could not stop it but could, in small ways, refuse to let it be completely invisible. That is what history actually is. Not the annals, not the official record, the marginal notes, the private letters, the supply lists with the names in them, the traces that the ordinary acts of ordinary people leave behind when the system does not think to look there. Lady Yoon's name is in those traces. She was there, for 500 years. The official record said nothing about her, but she was there, and now you know. If you stayed with this to the end, I want to ask you something. What did you know about Joseon Korea before tonight, and what is different now? Comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me which part of this history you want me to go deeper on, because what I have given you tonight is the reconstruction, the framework built from the sources that survived. There is more in those sources. The individual women whose names appear in the temple records, the specific officials like Kim Jong-juk, whose objections cost them everything, the political events that determined which widows were classified and which were not, the long history of scholarly recovery that has brought these documents back into the light after 5 centuries. Hit subscribe if you want to keep going, because Lady Yun was not the only one, and the marginal notes have not run out yet.